You always think you know the people closest to you until one day, they prove you wrong. For me, that day came like a sledgehammer to the gut. Julie, my wife, the woman I thought I'd spend my life with, betrayed me with Luke, my own younger brother. I had always been the odd one out in my family. Luke was the favorite, the golden boy who could do no wrong. Growing up, I was the one who worked quietly in the background while Luke basked in the spotlight. My parents doted on him, excusing every mistake, while I was left to fend for myself. I thought maybe adulthood would balance things out, but it only magnified the differences. When I met Julie, I thought she'd be my escape from that family dynamic. She was everything I thought I needed: charming, supportive, and someone who understood me. Or so I believed. We built a life together, or at least I thought we did. That illusion shattered the moment I walked in on her whispering to Luke in the kitchen, their body language giving away more than words ever could. At first, I tried to tell myself it wasn't what it looked like. But the truth hit me like a freight train when I overheard them one night. Julie's voice was low, almost pleading, "Luke, we can't keep doing this. What if he finds out?" And there it was, confirmation that my wife and my brother had been sneaking around behind my back. The confrontation was chaotic. I demanded answers, but neither of them had the decency to deny it. Julie cried, blaming me for being distant and uninspiring. Luke stood there with his arms crossed, smirking like he had won some prize. "You never treated her right," he said, like he was some savior. The betrayal cut deeper than I ever thought possible. It wasn't just Julie's affair, it was the realization that my family, my own blood, had been complicit. When my parents found out, I hoped for their support. Instead, they told me to get over it and stop being dramatic. They even went as far as to defend Luke, saying, "He's young. He makes mistakes." Mistakes? This wasn't a mistake. This was a deliberate act of cruelty from the two people I trusted most. I felt like I was drowning, surrounded by people who only cared about themselves. That night, I packed a bag and left the house, vowing to never look back. But walking away was just the beginning of the storm. The days that followed felt like wading through quicksand. Everywhere I turned, I was suffocating under the weight of betrayal. My family's reaction was worse than the affair itself. In their eyes, I wasn't the victim. I was the problem. They rallied around Julie and Luke almost immediately, as if their affair was some unfortunate misunderstanding rather than a calculated betrayal. My parents, who had spent a lifetime putting Luke on a pedestal, made excuses for him. "He's young," they said. "These things happen." As if that could justify the destruction of a marriage, a family. The way they dismissed my pain was a slap in the face. For the first time in my life, I realized just how little I meant to them. Even my siblings, the ones I thought might at least try to see my side, turned their backs on me. They refused to acknowledge the gravity of what Luke had done. Instead, they accused me of being too rigid, too unforgiving, as though my refusal to sweep everything under the rug was the real betrayal. The worst part wasn't their words, though. It was their silence. Not one of them called to check on me or asked how I was coping. My parents stopped answering my calls altogether, and when I finally worked up the nerve to visit, they wouldn't even let me in the house. They told me I needed to cool off and stop making this into a family issue. As if Luke's affair with my wife wasn't a family issue. Julie, of course, stayed with them for a while after I left. That much I learned through mutual acquaintances. My mother doted on her, cooking her meals and fussing over her like she was the victim. It was as though they had completely erased my existence, as if I were the one who had done something wrong. I can't count the number of times I sat alone in my new apartment, replaying every interaction, every moment leading up to the affair, wondering if I had missed some glaring sign. Maybe I had been too naive, too trusting. But then I'd remember the way Luke always seemed to look at Julie when he thought I wasn't paying attention, the way she'd brush it off whenever I mentioned it. In hindsight, the clues were there, but I never imagined my brother would betray me like that. Not in my worst nightmares. The rejection from my family hit harder than I thought it would. It wasn't just the betrayal of trust, it was the complete erasure of who I was to them. They didn't just choose Julie and Luke, they cast me out like I was disposable. Growing up, I always felt like the outsider in my own family, but now it was clear that I was never really part of it to begin with. There was one moment I'll never forget. I had gone back to the house to collect the rest of my things, and when I arrived, Julie and Luke were there together, laughing with my parents in the living room. It was like I had walked into an alternate reality where I never existed. They didn't even acknowledge me when I walked in. Julie acted like she owned the place, like she hadn't just ripped my life apart. I grabbed what I could and left, vowing never to step foot in that house again. It wasn't just the betrayal, It was the way they all seemed so unaffected by it. There was no guilt, no shame, no remorse. They carried on as if nothing had happened, while I was left to pick up the pieces of a life that no longer felt like my own. I couldn't wrap my head around how easily they discarded me, how little my pain mattered to them. I thought about confronting them, about demanding answers, but I knew it would be pointless. They had already made their choice, and it wasn't me. The realization was crushing, but it was also freeing in a way. For the first time, I understood that I couldn't rely on them. Not now, not ever. If I wanted to survive this, I'd have to do it on my own. So I stopped reaching out. I stopped hoping they would come around, that they would see the hurt they were causing me. I blocked their numbers, deleted their photos from my phone, and tried to move forward. It wasn't easy. Every time I thought about them, it felt like a fresh wound, but I knew I couldn't let them drag me down any further. In the end, their betrayal wasn't just about choosing Julie and Luke, it was about choosing convenience over integrity. It was easier for them to side with the people who stayed, to avoid confronting the ugliness of the situation. And as much as it hurt, I knew I had to let them go. Because if they couldn't stand by me when I needed them most, then they were never really my family to begin with. When I left them behind, I felt like I was stepping off a cliff into the unknown. 4 years, my life had been tethered to them. My family, my marriage, the routines that came with it all. Now, I had nothing but the clothes I'd packed and the hollow ache of betrayal. I told myself that this wasn't the end, that it was just a new chapter, but in the beginning, it didn't feel that way. It felt like I was free falling, waiting to hit the ground. The first weeks were the hardest. I moved into a small, bare apartment on the other side of town. It was nothing like the house Julie and I had shared. There was no warmth, no life. Just cold, empty walls and a mattress on the floor. Most nights, I'd lie there staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my head. The what-ifs haunted me. What if I'd noticed sooner? What if I'd fought harder for my place in the family? What if I'd been enough? I avoided people. Even the thought of casual conversations with strangers at the grocery store made me feel exposed, like they could see the shame I was carrying. I didn't tell my coworkers what had happened. I couldn't stomach the idea of them whispering behind my back, pitying me for being the man whose wife had betrayed him with his own brother. So I buried myself in work, arriving early, staying late, taking on every project that came my way just to keep my mind occupied. But the emptiness followed me everywhere. On weekends, when I had no distractions, it was unbearable. I'd spend hours scrolling through my phone, instinctively wanting to call someone, anyone, but realizing there was no one to call. My family had chosen their side, and my friends, the ones Julie and I had shared, had either distanced themselves or stayed neutral, which felt like another betrayal. Neutrality, after all, still left me alone. Eventually, I forced myself to confront the silence. It was either that or let it swallow me whole. I started running every morning, even though I'd never been much of an athlete. The physical exhaustion was a welcome reprieve from the constant mental anguish. It became a ritual, one foot in front of the other, mile after mile, until the pain in my legs drowned out the ache in my chest. Therapy was another step forward, though I was hesitant at first. Admitting I needed help felt like admitting defeat, but I was desperate for something, anything, to ease the weight pressing down on me. My therapist didn't sugarcoat things. She told me healing wasn't linear and that it would take time, more time than I wanted to give. But she also told me something I hadn't heard in a long time, that I didn't deserve what had happened, that none of this was my fault. Those words, simple as they were, stuck with me. Piece by piece, I started rebuilding. I threw myself into hobbies I hadn't touched in years. Woodworking, photography, even cooking. They were small things, but they reminded me that I still had control over parts of my life, that I could create something new even when everything else felt broken. I joined a local community group, forcing myself to meet new people, though it was awkward at first. Every interaction felt like a performance, like I was trying to prove I was fine when I clearly wasn't. But slowly, those walls started to come down. Financially, I was stable, which was a blessing. Julie and I didn't have any shared assets beyond the house, and I let her keep that without a fight. It wasn't worth the emotional toll. What little I had, I made count. I redecorated the apartment, adding touches that felt like me rather than us. I replaced the mattress with a proper bed, hung up prints of landscapes I'd photographed, and bought a plant I somehow managed not to kill. It wasn't much, but it felt like progress. The most surprising part of the process was discovering how much strength I had buried beneath years of self-doubt. For so long, I had let myself be defined by how others saw me, Julie, my family, even Luke. But now, with no one else to lean on, I realized I didn't need their validation to move forward. I was capable of standing on my own, even if it meant stumbling along the way. Of course, the pain didn't just disappear. There were still nights when the loneliness felt unbearable, when the memories crept in uninvited. Seeing families at the park or couples holding hands on the street would trigger a wave of grief I couldn't shake. But instead of running from those feelings, I learned to sit with them, to let them come and go like passing storms. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. By the time a few months had passed, I started to feel the smallest flicker of hope. It wasn't much, just a quiet realization that I could survive this, that I could build a life that was mine alone. It didn't erase the hurt or the betrayal, but it gave me something to hold on to. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I believed that maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind me. I wasn't actively keeping tabs on Julie and Luke after I left. As far as I was concerned, they could live in the mess they'd created. But in a small town, news has a way of finding you whether you want it to or not. Little by little, the story of their so-called relationship started trickling back to me. At first, it seemed like everything was going well for them. People whispered about how they were official now, showing up to family events and public outings together like nothing had happened. My family, naturally, played along, pretending this new arrangement was perfectly normal. I heard from mutual acquaintances that Julie was staying with my parents, comfortably nestled into the same house I'd grown up in, as if she had simply swapped me out for Luke. For a while, I tried to ignore it, but there was something infuriating about the way they carried on without consequence. It was like they had rewritten the narrative entirely, casting themselves as star-crossed lovers instead of the backstabbers they really were. But life, I learned, has a way of balancing the scales. It started with whispers of tension between Julie and Luke. People close to them, friends who weren't loyal enough to keep their secrets, mentioned that things weren't as picture-perfect as they appeared. Luke, the same guy who had so effortlessly stolen my wife, was already losing interest. It didn't surprise me. Luke was never the kind of person who valued anything he had, especially if it came easy. He thrived on the chase, not the commitment. Julie, on the other hand, seemed to realize too late that she'd made a mistake. Luke wasn't me. He didn't care about stability or family or even loyalty. The same charm he had used to pull her in was now being directed at someone else. Rumors started circulating that he had been seen with another woman, someone younger and flashier. Apparently, he was already finding ways to occupy his time when Julie wasn't looking. Then, as if on cue, the bottom fell out. I got word one evening, through a mutual friend who couldn't resist sharing, that Luke had left Julie. Just like that. No drawn-out breakup, no second chances. He had simply packed his things, moved out of my parents' house, and started up with a new woman without so much as a backward glance. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man she had betrayed me for, the one she had thrown away our marriage for, had turned out to be as selfish and unreliable as I had always known him to be. And Julie, who had once told me she needed something more than what I could give her, was left with nothing. From what I heard, her life began to unravel after that. Without Luke, she had nowhere to go. My parents, ever the enablers, let her stay in the house for a while, but even they had their limits. It wasn't long before she overstayed her welcome, and they gently nudged her out the door. She moved into a small rental on the outskirts of town, barely scraping by on her income. Her attempts to play the victim were almost laughable. She went around telling anyone who would listen that Luke had used her, that she had been blinded by love and didn't know what she was doing. She painted herself as the wounded party, conveniently glossing over the fact that she had willingly destroyed a marriage to chase after him. Part of me wanted to confront her, to call out the hypocrisy and force her to face the consequences of her actions. But I didn't. I had no interest in getting dragged back into her chaos. I had spent too long rebuilding my life to let her derail it again. Besides, watching her self-destruct from a distance was more satisfying than any confrontation could have been. What surprised me most was how little sympathy she got from the people around her. Even my family, who had so staunchly defended her and Luke in the beginning, seemed to grow weary of her constant drama. My mother, who had once treated Julie like a second daughter, stopped inviting her over. My siblings, who had chosen her side over mine, started to keep their distance. It was as if, without Luke to validate her place in their lives, they didn't know what to do with her. The Julie I had once known, the confident, composed woman I fell in love with, was gone. In her place was someone bitter and desperate, clinging to whatever scraps of attention she could get. It was a strange thing to witness, even from afar. I didn't feel sorry for her, not after what she had done, but I couldn't help but think about how far she had fallen. By the time Luke's new relationship fizzled out, as I knew it would, He had already moved on to the next shiny object. And Julie. She was left picking up the pieces of a life she had willingly shattered. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated, to take satisfaction in her downfall. But mostly I just felt nothing. Her pain didn't erase mine. Her failure didn't undo the damage she had caused. Still, it was a reminder that actions have consequences, even if they don't come right away. And in the quiet moments, when I thought about how much I had lost, I found a small sliver of comfort in knowing that, in the end, she had lost too. Maybe not in the same way, but enough to make her understand what betrayal feels like. Enough to make her question if it was worth it. Just as I started to feel a semblance of normalcy in my life, the past came knocking, figuratively and literally. My family, who had all but discarded me in favor of Julie and Luke, suddenly found their way back into my life. It wasn't because they'd come to their senses or realized the pain they'd caused me. No, it was because their golden boy, Luke, had abandoned Julie, and now, suddenly, the burden of fixing everything fell on me. It began with a phone call from my mother, her voice dripping with a mix of faux concern and forced cheerfulness. She didn't waste time with pleasantries, diving straight into her pitch. Julie's having such a hard time, dear. She's been through so much, and she really regrets what happened. Don't you think it's time to let bygones be bygones? For the family's sake. The audacity of it stunned me. After months of silence, months where they had turned their backs on me, laughed with Julie and Luke, and treated my pain like a minor inconvenience, they suddenly wanted me to play the role of the forgiving husband. As if I owed them, or her, anything. I hung up without answering, but the calls didn't stop. One by one, my family reached out. My father, usually stoic and uninterested in emotional matters, tried to frame it as a practical issue. According to him, it was about maintaining the harmony of the family. He didn't even pretend to care about my feelings. He just wanted things smoothed over so he wouldn't have to deal with the awkwardness of broken relationships. My siblings, too, jumped on the bandwagon. My sister called to remind me that family is forever, and that I needed to consider what was best for everyone. My younger brother, one of Luke's closest allies, had the nerve to tell me I was being stubborn, as if my refusal to reconcile with Julie was the root of the problem. Not Luke's betrayal. Not Julie's choices. Me. The turning point came when my parents decided to show up at my apartment unannounced. I opened the door to find them standing there, my mother holding a dish of casserole like it was some peace offering that would magically erase everything. My father loomed behind her, arms crossed, his expression unreadable but clearly there to back her up. They didn't ask to come in, they just walked past me, as though they still had that authority over my life. My mother sat at the tiny table in my kitchen, launching into a monologue about family, forgiveness, and how much Julie missed me. My father stood silently, nodding occasionally, as though his presence alone would convince me to give in. I didn't argue. I didn't yell or demand they leave. I just listened, arms crossed, waiting for them to finish. When my mother finally paused to take a breath, I told them in no uncertain terms that I wanted nothing to do with Julie, Luke, or the family that had abandoned me when I needed them most. My mother teared up, playing the role of the heartbroken matriarch. She spoke about how hard this was for her, as though her discomfort somehow outweighed the betrayal I had endured. My father, predictably, accused me of being too emotional, too stuck in the past to see the bigger picture. But I stood firm. I told them that I had spent months rebuilding my life from the ashes of their betrayal, and I wasn't about to undo all that progress just to make things easier for them. I reminded them that they had chosen their sides long ago and that they had no right to demand anything from me now. They left, eventually, but not before my mother issued one final plea, her voice trembling with what I can only describe as desperation. Don't let pride ruin this family, dear. We're all hurting. Hurting. As if they had been the ones betrayed. As if they hadn't spent months ignoring my existence while coddling Julie and Luke. The sheer hypocrisy of it left me shaking with anger long after they'd gone. After that, the pressure only escalated. Julie herself tried to reach out, sending messages that ranged from apologetic to manipulative. She claimed to miss me, to regret everything she had done. But her words rang hollow. I could tell she wasn't sorry for what she had done. She was sorry for the consequences. She wasn't reaching out because she loved me. She was reaching out because she needed someone to save her from the mess she had made. The family's attempts to wear me down continued. They sent emails, texts, even letters, all filled with the same tired arguments about forgiveness and family unity. At one point, my sister forwarded me a long message from Julie, complete with photos of her looking forlorn and, apparently, regretful. It was so absurd I almost laughed. But their efforts weren't without effect. The constant barrage of guilt and manipulation began to wear on me, making me question my own choices. Was I being too harsh? Was I letting my anger cloud my judgment? They seemed so sure that reconciliation was the right thing to do. Could they all really be wrong? In those moments of doubt, I reminded myself of one simple truth. None of them had stood by me when it mattered. When I was at my lowest, they had sided with Julie and Luke without hesitation. Their sudden concern for family wasn't about me. It was about convenience, about sweeping everything under the rug so they could go back to pretending nothing had happened. And I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't sacrifice my peace, my self-respect, for people who had proven time and again that my pain meant nothing to them. So, I held the line, even as they pushed harder and harder. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Because if there was one thing I had learned through all of this, it was that sometimes the only way to heal is to let go, even if that means letting go of the people you once called family. After months of avoiding Julie's messages and ignoring the family's endless attempts to guilt me into taking her back, I thought the storm might finally pass. But Julie wasn't the kind of person to fade quietly into the background. Her desperation, fueled by the collapse of her life and the family's pressure to reconcile, escalated in ways I could never have anticipated. It started with small intrusions. Julie began showing up at places she knew I frequented. At first, it seemed like a coincidence, a chance meeting at the grocery store or the coffee shop near my apartment. But the frequency of these accidental encounters made it clear they weren't accidents at all. She'd hover near me, pretending to browse the shelves or sip her coffee, her eyes darting toward me like a nervous predator sizing up its prey. She never approached outright, but her presence was suffocating, a constant reminder of everything I was trying to leave behind. Then came the messages, texts, emails, even handwritten notes left on my car windshield. They ranged from apologetic pleas for forgiveness to veiled accusations that I was being cold-hearted and unreasonable. She painted herself as a victim, claiming she had been swept up in a moment of weakness and deserved a second chance. But no amount of flowery language could erase the memory of what she'd done, or the cold, calculated decisions that had led to it. When I didn't respond, her tactics became more invasive. One day, I came home to find her waiting outside my apartment building. She was holding a box of things she claimed I had forgotten at the house. Old books, a sweater, a watch that hadn't worked in years. It wasn't about returning my belongings. It was an excuse to see me, to force me into a conversation I didn't want to have. I refused to take the box, told her to leave, and walked past her without another word. But her voice followed me as I entered the building, trembling with emotion as she begged me to stop being so cruel. It took every ounce of restraint I had not to turn around and yell, not to unload the months of anger and frustration that had built up inside me. Instead, I slammed the door behind me and let her words echo in the empty hallway. The turning point came when Julie showed up at my workplace. It was a quiet afternoon, and I was halfway through a report when I looked up to see her standing in the lobby. The sight of her there, dressed impeccably, her face carefully composed, made my stomach drop. She had no business being there, and yet she stood as if she belonged, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. I tried to ignore her, hoping she'd leave on her own. But Julie wasn't one to back down easily. She approached my desk, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of my coworkers as she demanded to talk to me. I felt my face flush with humiliation as I quietly told her to leave, but she didn't budge. She started recounting our history, dredging up memories of happier times as if they could somehow erase the betrayal. The attention from my coworkers only seemed to fuel her performance. She began to cry, clutching her chest as though she were the one who had been wronged. The room fell uncomfortably silent, and I could feel the stares of my colleagues as they pretended not to listen. I wanted to disappear, to crawl under my desk and wait for it to be over. But instead, I stood and walked away, leaving her standing there with her tears and her accusations. That night, I knew I had to take action. Julie's behavior was no longer just an annoyance, it was a threat to my peace, my privacy, and my mental health. The next day, I met with a lawyer to discuss my options. I hated the idea of involving the courts, but I couldn't see another way to protect myself. After reviewing the messages, the visits, and the incident at my workplace, my lawyer recommended filing for a restraining order. The process wasn't easy. It felt like a public declaration of failure, a final nail in the coffin of a life I had spent years building. But it was necessary. Julie's escalating behavior left me no choice, and I wasn't willing to risk what little stability I had regained. When the restraining order was granted, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. It was a victory, yes, but it also marked the end of any lingering hope that Julie might one day take responsibility for her actions and leave me in peace. The woman I had loved, the one I had built a life with, was gone. In her place was someone I barely recognized, someone manipulative, relentless, and unwilling to accept the consequences of her choices. Word of the restraining order spread quickly, thanks in part to my family, who viewed it as an act of betrayal against them, too. My mother called me, her voice trembling with anger, accusing me of being vindictive and cruel. "She's been through enough," she said, as though Julie's pain outweighed my own. But I stood firm. I told her, plainly and without emotion, that I had done what I needed to do to protect myself. If they couldn't understand that, it was their problem, not mine. I hung up before she could respond and blocked her number, adding her to the growing list of people I had cut out of my life. The restraining order didn't erase the scars Julie had left, but it gave me something I hadn't felt in months: control. For the first time, I could breathe without worrying about where she might show up next, what she might say or do to manipulate me. It wasn't closure, not yet, but it was a step in the right direction. And for now, that was enough. If I thought filing the restraining order would finally put an end to the chaos, I was wrong. It wasn't long before my family retaliated. They weren't just upset, they were furious. In their eyes, I had crossed an unforgivable line by dragging Julie's behavior into the legal system. The restraining order became the spark that reignited their campaign to pull me back into the fold, to force me to fix the broken family they still refused to admit they had helped destroy. It started with messages, endless streams of texts and voicemails from my parents and siblings, each one angrier than the last. My mother accused me of tearing the family apart, claiming the restraining order was a public embarrassment for everyone involved. My father was more direct, calling me selfish and weak for not handling the situation like a man. They didn't care about the years of betrayal or the months of manipulation. All they cared about was the shame it brought to the family name. My siblings chimed in, parroting the same arguments. My sister, who had always been the most neutral of the group, tried to play peacemaker, urging me to consider what's best for the family. My younger brother, Luke's biggest supporter, wasn't so diplomatic. He called me a coward and claimed I was punishing Julie out of spite. It was almost laughable, coming from someone who had never once stood in my corner when it mattered. At first, I ignored them. I let their calls go to voicemail, deleted their texts without reading them, and avoided every invitation to talk things through. But their persistence was unrelenting. They showed up at my apartment unannounced, left notes on my door, and even contacted some of my coworkers to express their concerns. It was like they couldn't comprehend that I had moved on, that I didn't need or want their approval anymore. The final straw came when they organized a family meeting, without asking me, and demanded I attend. I almost didn't go. Every instinct told me to stay home, to protect the fragile peace I had carved out for myself. But a small part of me, the part that still clung to the idea of family, needed closure. So I went, knowing full well it wouldn't end well. The meeting was held at my parents' house, the same house where I had grown up feeling like an outsider. Walking through the door, I was hit by a wave of memories, both good and bad, but mostly bad. The living room was filled with familiar faces. My parents, my siblings, even a couple of aunts and uncles who had no business being there. Julie wasn't present, thankfully, but her absence didn't make the atmosphere any less hostile. The conversation started with feigned civility. My mother talked about how much she missed the old days when we were all close, and my father mentioned how important it was to heal as a family. But their true intentions became clear soon enough. They wanted me to drop the restraining order. They wanted me to forgive Julie, to take her back, to restore the image of a happy, united family. It wasn't about me or my well-being. It was about their pride, their need to pretend everything was fine. When I refused, calmly, but firmly, their masks of concern slipped away. My father exploded, accusing me of being immature and selfish. My mother started crying, blaming me for putting her through this. My siblings took turns berating me, each of them more focused on their discomfort than the years of betrayal I had endured. One of my uncles even suggested that I was holding a grudge and needed to be a man about it. I sat there, listening to their accusations, their guilt trips, their justifications for Julie and Luke's actions, and something inside me snapped. For months, I had been carrying the weight of their rejection, their manipulation, their inability to see me as anything other than a scapegoat. But in that moment, I realized I didn't have to carry it anymore. I stood up, my voice steady but firm, and told them exactly how I felt. I told them how they had abandoned me when I needed them most, how they had chosen Julie and Luke over their own son and brother. I reminded them of the pain I had endured, the nights I spent questioning my worth, and how their betrayal had cut just as deep as Julie's affair. And I told them, in no uncertain terms, that I was done. I told them I didn't owe them forgiveness, and I certainly didn't owe it to Julie. I wasn't going to sacrifice my peace for their convenience, and I wasn't going to play along with their fantasy of a perfect family. If they wanted to repair things, they could start by taking responsibility for their actions and the role they had played in my pain. Until then, I was done trying. The room fell silent. My father looked like he wanted to yell, but for once, he didn't. My mother just stared at me, her tears frozen mid-sob. My siblings shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. And in that silence, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: relief. For the first time, I had spoken my truth without fear of their judgment. I walked out of the house and didn't look back. As I drove away, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, sadness, but also a deep, unshakable sense of freedom. They had tried to break me, to drag me back into the toxicity I had fought so hard to escape. But they hadn't succeeded. I was still standing, and for the first time, I truly felt like I was standing on my own. In the weeks following the confrontation with my family, the silence was deafening. No more calls, no more texts, no more unwelcome visits. It was as though they had finally realized I wasn't going to bend, wasn't going to let their expectations dictate my life anymore. The quiet was both unsettling and freeing. For the first time in what felt like years, I could finally breathe. But moving forward wasn't as simple as cutting ties. The scars of betrayal and abandonment didn't just vanish once the noise stopped. There were days when I still found myself consumed by memories of Julie, of Luke, of my family's betrayal. I'd catch myself replaying old conversations, wondering what I could have said or done differently. Grief has a way of sneaking up on you like that. Just when you think you're past it, it grabs hold of you and pulls you back under. I had to learn to sit with that grief, to acknowledge it without letting it control me. Therapy helped. My sessions became less about untangling the pain of betrayal and more about rebuilding my sense of self. I had spent so long defining myself through my relationships, husband, son, brother, that I didn't really know who I was outside of those roles. My therapist pushed me to ask hard questions. What did I want for myself? What did happiness look like to me? At first, I didn't have answers. But over time, I started to piece them together. Happiness, I realized, wasn't some grand, unattainable thing. It was in the small moments, the early morning runs that cleared my mind, the satisfaction of completing a project at work, the quiet evenings spent cooking a meal for no one but myself. It was in the freedom to live on my terms, without the weight of other people's expectations dragging me down. One of the biggest changes I made was letting people back into my life, but only the ones who had earned a place there. Through therapy, I realized I didn't have to isolate myself to protect my peace. I could have meaningful connections without compromising my boundaries. So I reconnected with old friends, the ones who had stayed neutral during the chaos but had never pressured me to forgive what couldn't be forgiven. I even made new friends through the community group I had joined, people who knew me only as I was now, not as the man I had been before everything fell apart. The hardest part, by far, was learning to trust again. Not just other people but myself. For a long time, I blamed myself for not seeing the signs, for letting Julie and Luke get away with what they did for so long. It was easy to fall into the trap of thinking I was somehow at fault, that if I had been better, smarter, stronger, more attentive, none of it would have happened. But the truth is, their betrayal said more about them than it ever did about me. That realization didn't erase the pain, but it did make it easier to let go of the guilt. Eventually, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Hope that my life wasn't defined by what had happened, that I could create something new, something better. I didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. I was excited by the possibilities. Julie and Luke, meanwhile, faded into the background. I heard bits and pieces about them from mutual acquaintances. How Julie had struggled to hold down a job, how Luke had moved on to another relationship that was already showing cracks. But I didn't dwell on it. Their lives were no longer my concern. The best revenge, I realized, wasn't in watching them suffer. It was in building a life so full, so rich with meaning, that they couldn't touch it. As for my family, the estrangement became permanent. It hurt, of course. No matter how toxic they were still my family, and there was a part of me that mourned what could have been. But I knew I couldn't go back. Not after everything they had done, and certainly not after they had shown me who they truly were. Letting go of them wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And in their absence, I found room to grow, to build connections with people who valued me for who I was, not for what I could give them. Life isn't perfect. There are still moments when the pain resurfaces, when I catch myself wondering how things might have been different if only. But those moments are fewer and farther between now. They don't define me anymore. What defines me is the life I've built since, one filled with purpose, peace, and a sense of self-worth I never thought I'd find again. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that betrayal doesn't have to break you. It will hurt, yes. It will change you. But it doesn't have to destroy you. You can take that pain and use it to rebuild, to create something stronger, something better. And in doing so, you can find a kind of freedom that no one can take away from you. That's what I've done. And for the first time in years, I'm proud of the man I see in the mirror.